Puss in Boots. A miller left all he had to his 3 sons. To the eldest he gave the mill, to the second he gave the ass, to the third the cat. Very sad was the youngest over what fell to him. The 2 eldest were not kind. They managed very well together. The first ground the corn into flour, and the second took it about in sacks on the ass and sold it. But the third could do nothing with the cat but keep the mill clear of rats and mice. One day he said, "I am very much alone and very poor in the world, and I live on the charity of my brothers. They will soon turn me out, and then I shall die of hunger and cold whenever my cat has devoured the last mouse." The cat heard him, came and rubbed himself against his legs, and said, "Do not be troubled, dear master. Have a pair of boots made for me, and give me a sack, and you will soon see that you are better off with me than are your brothers with the mill and the ass." The young man had got a piece of gold in his pocket. It was all the money he had. He spent that in getting a pair of very handsome boots for his cat, and he also got a sack as Puss required. When the cat had got what he asked for, then he drew on his boots. They were topped with crimson leather, and he threw the sack over his shoulder and went away to a warren where there were many rabbits. Then he put some sow thistles and some bran at the bottom of the sack, and throwing himself down as though he were dead, he waited till some foolish young rabbit should come and be snared. Nor had he long to wait, for very soon a silly bunny came up, and, attracted by what was in the sack, went in. Then the cat drew the cords that shut the neck of the sack and killed the rabbit. Very proud of what he had done, he went to the king's palace and asked to speak with his majesty. He was readily admitted, when, marching in his boots to the foot of the throne, he made a profound bow, and throwing down the rabbit on the steps of the dais, said, "Sire, the Marquess of Carabas has enjoined me to present you with a rabbit from his warren. With onion sauce, boiled, your majesty will find it excellent." "Tell your master," answered the king, "that he could hardly have afforded me a greater pleasure. My cook never dreams of sending me up rabbit, on which I dote. Thank him cordially from me." Next day the cat concealed himself in the standing corn, with his sack open. Soon 2 partridges entered. He drew the strings and caught them. Then again he went to the palace and presented them to the king in the name of his master, the Marquess of Carabas. The king was delighted, and ordered that the messenger should be given something to drink. The cat asked for a saucerful of milk. He touched nothing stronger, said he, on principle he was a teetotaler. The cat continued his course. He caught in like manner pheasant, woodcock, snipe, teal, wild duck, fieldfare, and kept the palace larder pretty well supplied with game during the season. One day, when the cat knew that the king was going out a drive beside the river, along with his daughter, who was the loveliest princess in the world and heir to his throne, the cat said to his master, "If you will follow my advice, your fortune is made. You have but to bathe in the river at the spot I shall point out to you, and leave the rest to me." The young fellow did as was advised, without understanding what was the purpose of the cat. Whilst he was in the water, the carriage of the king drew near. It was gilded and had glass windows, and was drawn by cream-colored horses with gold and red trappings. The cat now began to run up and down the bank, screaming, "Help! Help! My master, the Marquess of Carabas, will be drowned." The king, hearing the cries, put his head out of the window and bade the coachman draw up. Then he recognized the cat which had brought him so many good things. He called the cat to the carriage side and asked what distressed him. "Sire," answered the cat, "whilst the most noble, the Marquess of Carabas, has been bathing, some thieves have run away with his clothes. I am afraid if he remains much longer in the water he may have cramp and go under." In fact, the cat had carried away his master's poor, mean garments, and had hidden them under a stone. The king, who was not merely compassionate, but also generous, and not above feeling gratitude for services rendered, at once ordered his attendants to go back to the palace for the most splendid suit they could find. "I believe," said the king, "there is a very fine suit made for me some 20 years ago, when I was a-courting. I was then less corpulent than at present. You will find it in the lower right-hand drawer of the mahogany chest. I have little doubt it will fit the Marquess to a nicety. That is, if he is a graceful man. I was immensely graceful 20 years ago." Owing to the minute and exact instruction given by his majesty, the suit, which was exceedingly splendid, was soon found and brought to the lad in the water, who quickly clothed himself in it, and then came to the coach door to pay his respects to the king and the princess. The youth looked so engaging in the dress in which his royal highness had been invested when he went courting her mother that the princess immediately lost her heart to him, and felt that the world to her would be a blank without him. The king was also touched, for the sight of the youth in his suit, which he became rather than the suit became him, awoke old feelings of sentimentality in the bosom of the king. He wiped his eyes and entreated the most noble marquess to enter the carriage with him and his daughter, and nudging the princess, he whispered, "I was like that when I went a sweethearting." The cat, delighted that his schemes had so well succeeded, ran on ahead of the carriage, and having passed through a field in which harvesters were cutting and making stacks of golden corn, he said to them, "Good people, unless you tell the king who is coming this way that these cornfields belong to the Marquess of Carabas, you will all be made mincemeat of." The harvesters were somewhat alarmed at the appearance of the cat in boots. They were exceedingly afraid of being made into mincemeat. Presently the gilded coach of the king passed. He stopped it and inquired of the peasants to whom these splendid fields of grain belonged. They answered, as they had been instructed, "To the most noble, the Marquess of Carabas." "Upon my word," said the king, addressing the miller's son, "you have a noble heritage." The young man bowed and blushed, and the king and princess were pleased at his modesty. The king nudged his daughter and whispered, "I was tremendously shy when I went a courting." The cat ran ahead and came into a meadow in which were mowers making hay. He said to them, "Good people, unless you tell the king who is coming this way that these meadows belong to the Marquess of Carabas, you will all be pickled like young walnuts." When the king soon after came into the meadow and smelt the sweet hay, he bade the coach stop, and he inquired of the mowers to whom the meadows belonged. They answered, as instructed, that they belonged to the most noble, the Marquess of Carabas. "Goodness!" exclaimed the king, addressing the miller's son, "you have indeed a noble heritage." The young man stammered something unintelligible. The king nudged his daughter and said in a whisper, "I also stuttered and stammered when I was paying my addresses to your mother." The cat ran on and passed through a forest in which woodcutters were engaged thinning the timber. He halted and addressed them and said, "Good people, unless you say that all these woods belong to the Marquess of Carabas, you will all be stewed in your syrup like prunes." When soon after this the king's coach entered the woods, the king called to the driver to stop, and he signed to a woodcutter to come up. He asked him whose forests these were, and he replied that they belonged to the most noble, the Marquess of Carabas. "Well, I never!" exclaimed the king to the miller's son. "You have verily a splendid inheritance." The poor lad was so bewildered that all he could do was to respond with a sickly smile. The king nudged his daughter and whispered, "I also sniggered when I asked your mother to name the day. She said my snigger was more eloquent than words." The cat ran on, and saw at the end of the wood a magnificent palace. He went in, and found that it belonged to an ogre, who was also a magician and enormously rich, for all the lands through which the cat had run belonged to the domain of this palace. The cat asked leave to see the ogre. He said he could not think of passing that way without paying him his respects. The ogre received him with civility. Even ogres enjoy flattery. "I have been informed," said the cat, "that you are so clever and so profound in your acquirements that you can transform yourself into any shape you like. But this may be merely idle gossip, not based on any foundation of truth. For myself, I never believe half the tittle-tattle I hear." "But it is really true," said the ogre. The cat smiled incredulously. "I will at once show you my power," said the ogre, and in a moment transformed himself into a lion. The cat was so frightened that he made a bolt out of the window and ran up the water pipes and did not rest till he was on the roof. This was difficult for him because he wore boots, and boots are calculated for a high road and not for scrambling. After some time he plucked up courage to descend. "What do you think of my power now?" asked the ogre, who had resumed his former shape. "I think that your power is great," answered the cat, "yet hardly all that I should have thought had I given belief to what is said." "How so?" asked the ogre. "I heard, for instance, on my way here, that you were a great bear." "I could make myself that in a moment," answered the ogre. "I am sure you are that already," answered the cat courteously. "Others said you were an awful bore, or bore. I did not ask them to spell the word. I can transform myself into that instantly." "I am certain you need no transformation to be that most completely," said the cat with a bow. "I also heard that you were in reality quite insignificant as a personage, and nobody. Now, any fool can puff himself up into something greater than himself, but it takes a wise man to make himself appear less than he really is. Can you do that?" "In a moment," answered the ogre, and he changed himself into a mouse. Instantly the cat was on him and had eaten him. Then he walked to the gate of the palace, and arrived there just as the royal carriage drove up. "I wonder whose magnificent palace this is," said the king. Then the cat ran down the steps, opened the door of the carriage, and said, "Your Majesty, welcome to the palace of the most noble Marquess of Carabas." "Why, this is truly a surprise," said the king. "What a splendid inheritance is yours, Marquess! Give my daughter your arm. We will pick a crumb with you, Carabas. I'm vastly hungry with my drive." The miller's son clumsily offered his arm as bidden to the princess. Her father nudged her and whispered, "I was also a great gawky when I proposed to your mother." Then all entered the great hall, and the king could not contain his surprise and admiration at all he saw. The cat ran down into the kitchen and ordered up a cold collation, and into the cellars where he chose out the best wines. And the king said he had never enjoyed his victuals so heartily as that day. Then turning to the miller's son, he said, "If you like, Carabas, you shall be my son-in-law. Say, 'I adore you, will you be mine?' to the princess. I did that when I solicited the hand of her mother." The miller's son did not wait to be told this a second time. The princess at once accepted him, and they were married and lived happily. The cat became a great lord, and had no occasion to run after and eat mice.